So in the last lesson, we made our first query against our GraphQL database inside of our playground by asking for collections and then the items on them. But let's take a deeper dive into not only what other queries we have access to, but also some other handy features that we have with this playground. Well, one thing that we have other than the schema is actually the docs. And the docs gets composed by the playground itself to tell us more about the things inside of it that we might be curious about. So here we see all the queries that we have access to. If we click it, we can see that the details related to what we get back about it right here is that we get back a collection, and this collection has these properties. Now, if you're ever curious what the ID property with this ID type is, if you click this, it will tell you that it is a scalar type, right, that represents a unique identifier. It's often used to refetch an object or as a key for the cache, and it comes back as a string when we get it back as a JSON object. Now, what this means is that a scalar type is something for the computer language to know that it is a single value. Single meaning that it's not comprised of multiple things. So it's not an object, which might have multiple properties and multiple values. It's not an array, which might contain multiple different things. Scalar type is either a string, an integer, or a Boolean of some kind. It's more complicated than that, but that's the main thing you need to understand about it. But the main thing you need to know is that when it comes back to us, in the JSON object format that we want for our front end, it comes in as a string. So that's the main thing. Now, we can dig through these docs and look through all of the definitions for all of these things. And this is a handy thing for us to use if we're ever curious to look more about the backend related side of GraphQL and how it really gives us access to what types of properties inside of our application. But let's just continue with working with the queries because we'll naturally get a better understanding of it by doing rather than reading at this point, especially for this lesson. So the next thing I want to show you is let's make a query for the actual collection by title. Before we do that, I actually want to highlight one thing. You are actually not able to query for items specifically. I did not define that query for you guys because nowhere in our application do we actually make that request for items. So for example, you cannot actually make a request for just the items. If I get rid of this and this, so that what we're making is just simply a single query, you'll see you'll get an error. You cannot query the field for items, because I do not define that for you guys in the backend. So that's one instance where you got to really look at this schema to see what you have access to. And the reason I restricted this access is simply because we actually never use anything like this in our front end. So this is a very live example of seeing what you might or might not have access to. But let's make these other queries. So let's go through collection by ID first. The query name will be exactly what it is that you see inside of that schema. So if we look at this autocomplete, we'll see that we can query by this one collection. And here, let's say I want this one. So I'm going to copy this string. And in order for me to query by the collection, I just look at the shape of what it expects. It wants brackets, and it wants me to pass this variable ID with a value of the ID itself. So I'm literally going to say I'm going to pass the ID, and it's going to be equal to, and then I'm going to pass in the string. And now again, if I look at this highlight, it says I must say what subfields I want from this collection if it gets returned back to me. So if I want back, let's say the title, then when I make the request, I'm just going to get back this thing where I get back the data, which will always have this data, as well as this key that the collection is this object that simply has the title of hats. So really easy here. And what if we say use a ID that doesn't exist? Something like whatever. If I make this request now, I'll see that I get back a null object. Now this is important because every single type inside of GraphQL is a nullable type, meaning that it can either be whatever it is, right? So it can either be a string or it can be null. That's all it means. You can get back a string, right? Or the object. So for us, the collection, if it exists, but if it doesn't, then we'll always get back null. So that's a thing to keep in mind. When we write on our front end, if we make a request for, say, something like a specific ID, but our ID is wrong, well, we're going to get back a null object. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, especially when we start coding against this GraphQL API. Now, let's test out our last query. And our last query is going to be very similar from what we saw with this collection. The only difference is that we now pass in a title. And luckily for us, this doesn't have to be case sensitive. So if I do lowercase hats, and I want to see the title and the ID, and let's just get the items as well. And from the items, I want the ID, I want the name, I want the price, and I want the image URL. Now, if I make the request, you'll see that I get back this data object again. But here, you'll see that what I'm getting as the actual object itself is indicated by the name of the query. This was actually the case for all those other queries we made. They just also happen to look like what type we might be expecting. But just understand that the request you make will give you back data where the actual data sits under the name of the query that we made. So for us, it was get collections by title. So here, what we got back was the one object, and the one object has the ID, the title, which as we see is capitalized, but ours was lowercase, so it's not case sensitive, which is great. And then we get back our items. So this is going to be very similar like what we're going to use on our specific collection page component. So here we have a good idea kind of what it's like to actually make requests and queries against this database. But how do we actually do this on our front end? And especially how do we do this in React? Well, I'm going to show you. So in the next lesson, we are going to actually integrate using this GraphQL server and replacing what we already have for fetching these specific items and data inside of our application. So I'll see you in the next lesson.